The silence of the early morning seemed to have a weight of its own. Luke Wallen, his eyes fixed on the envelope he had just found, felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The library at Buckingham Manor, normally a welcoming space with its soft lighting and polished wooden shelves, now seemed oppressive, almost hostile. The air was heavy, and the only light came from the lampshade, which cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, filled with old books. The envelope trembled in his sweaty hands as he slid his fingers along the yellowed edge, trying to gather the courage to face whatever was inside. Part of him wanted to leave the document exactly where he had found it. He could ignore it, pretend he'd never seen it, and carry on with the unlikely arrangement he'd made with Julianne Buckingham, his wife of 7 days. But another part of him, the part that yearned for answers, couldn't help itself. With a heavy sigh, he finally opened the envelope. Inside were carefully organized pages, all typed up and annotated in detail. The titles of the documents immediately captured his attention: Real Estate Fraud Case, Martin Wallen and Howard Buckingham, Post-Bankruptcy Asset Analysis, and most devastatingly, a death certificate with Howard Buckingham's name on the header. Luke felt a chill run down his spine as he began to read. Each line felt like a sentence of condemnation, but not against him, against his father. There were forged contracts, suspicious bank transfers, and testimonies describing Martin Wallen as a man who had destroyed Howard Buckingham's fortune with empty promises of wealth. The story was all there: Howard mortgaging his properties, investing everything he had in a non-existent real estate project. When he realized he had been duped, it was too late. He died weeks later of a massive heart attack. Luke felt his stomach turn. He could barely remember his father's face, but now he knew that the man's actions had left a trail of destruction not only in his own family, but in Julianne's too. And now he understood. The marriage he thought was a simple contract of convenience was something much darker. Julianne knew. She had always known. The sound of footsteps upstairs brought him back to reality. They were light footsteps, but unmistakable. Luke quickly shoved the envelope back into the drawer where he had found it, trying to hide any evidence of his discovery. The sound of footsteps intensified, descending the stairs with a steady, deliberate cadence. He didn't have time to process his thoughts before the library door slowly opened. Julianne appeared, wrapped in an ivory silk robe that seemed to glow in the light of the lamp. Her grey hair was perfectly combed, even at this late hour. Her eyes met Luke's immediately, and he realized that there was something predatory about the way she was looking at him. "Can't sleep, darling?" she asked, with a smile that seemed as warm as it was calculated. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried an authority that couldn't be ignored. Luke tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He shook his head, trying to look calm, but he knew that his hands were still shaking. He hid them behind his back. "I think I'm getting used to the house," he finally replied, forcing a smile. "It's so big and quiet." Julianne took a few steps into the room, her bare feet barely making a sound on the polished wooden floor. She looked around the library as if assessing something invisible, but her gaze soon returned to him. Silent. "Yes. Sometimes I think it's almost as if the ghosts of Howard and everything we've lost are still here." Her voice had a thoughtful tone, but there was a hint of something else, something Luke couldn't identify. Anger, sadness, or perhaps just an attempt to provoke him. Luke felt sweat trickle down his temples. He needed to get out of there before she noticed his agitation. "I think I'll go upstairs and try to get some sleep," he said quickly, already moving towards the door. But before he could leave, Julianne placed a light but firm hand on his shoulder. He froze. "Luke," she said, her tone lower now, almost a whisper, "you know you can trust me, don't you?" He forced a smile. "Of course, Julianne." She let him go, but the smile she gave in response didn't reach her eyes. Luke left the library, feeling the weight of her gaze on his back until he turned down the corridor. When he reached his room, he closed the door carefully and leaned against it, trying to catch his breath. His mind was a storm of confused thoughts and growing fears. He knew he was in the middle of something much bigger than he had imagined, but the question was, what would he do next? A few weeks earlier, Luke was just a student trying to survive the pressures of a complicated life. For as long as he could remember, life had been an endless succession of difficulties. His father, Martin, had been a man who lived beyond his means, enthralled by get-rich-quick schemes and expensive vices. When Luke was just 12, Martin disappeared, leaving a pile of bills and a broken family. Luke's mother, Diane, did her best to support her 3 children, but her debilitating illness ended up putting her in the care of her eldest son. At just 16, Luke took on the role of father to his 2 younger siblings, Ashley and Kyle. He knew that his dreams had to be sacrificed. Any plans for a better life were postponed in the name of survival. Now 22, Luke was attending Missouri State University, struggling to get an economics degree while working 2 jobs and doing odd jobs to supplement his income. Fatigue was his constant companion, but the weight of family debts was even greater. He spent his nights awake, calculating how to pay for his mother's medical expenses and keep a roof over their heads. It was during one of these extra jobs, chopping wood for the Buckingham estate, that he met Julianne. She appeared on the veranda of his mansion like a figure from another world, with her perfectly combed silver hair and a dress that seemed to be worth more than Luke's annual income. She watched him for a while, before finally approaching him and starting a casual conversation. "You work hard, young man." There was something almost appreciative in her voice. Luke didn't know how to respond. He was used to wealthy clients treating him like he was invisible. "I only do what's necessary, ma'am," he replied, keeping his tone professional. Julianne smiled, an almost enigmatic smile. "Necessity is a powerful motivator. Maybe we can talk about it sometime." This interaction planted the seed for what was to follow. 2 weeks later, Julianne called him into her living room for a chat. She explained her proposal with a calmness that baffled him. Marriage. An agreement. Luke didn't have to love her, just accompany her and help her look after the farm, as she was struggling to run it on her own after being widowed. In return, she would ensure that all his debts were paid, his mother received the best possible treatment, and his brothers received the best education. Luke hesitated. It seemed surreal, almost undignified. But when he thought of his mother and brothers, and how their lives would change, he couldn't refuse. He accepted. The wedding was brief and emotionless. Julianne wore a black dress, and the justice of the peace seemed more interested in his watch than in the couple in front of him. Jordan had no friends or family present. He had lied to his mother, saying he had gotten an internship in another city. That first night, Julianne explained the rules. "There are no marital expectations between us. Just keep your end of the bargain by helping me run the farm." Her tone was cold, practical, almost professional. He nodded, feeling more like an employee than a husband. Life on the Buckingham farm was not as simple as Luke had imagined. Julianne was a woman full of layers, alternating between a warm hostess and an introspective figure whose silences said more than her words. She taught him how to look after the property, but seemed to keep certain places and secrets out of his reach. In the first week, he began to notice things that unsettled him. Objects that seemed to have been moved, phone calls that Julianne answered in whispers, and then there was the episode of the envelope in the library, which revealed the connection between his family and the Buckinghams. He couldn't get out of his head the possibility that there was more to the story than he could see. One evening, Luke decided to confront Julianne. "Why did you really want to marry me?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Julianne looked up from her tea, one eyebrow arched. "I told you, Luke. I needed someone I could trust to help me with the farm." "But why me? I don't have any business experience. You could easily have found a better partner." He couldn't contain the intensity in his voice. For a moment, Julianne seemed about to reply, but then she pulled back. She set the cup down on the saucer with a little clink and smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps you are more important to this family than you realize." The answer left Luke with more questions than answers, and that's when he decided to investigate on his own. Luke knew he couldn't go on living in uncertainty. Something about Julianne's behavior seemed to suggest that she was always one step ahead, as if she knew exactly what he was thinking or planning. Her movements were calculated, her words precisely chosen, and yet there were moments of vulnerability that deeply confused him. He decided to act. It was late at night, and Julianne had retired. The office, where Luke had discovered the documents a few days earlier, seemed the obvious place to start. With light steps, he descended the stairs to the first floor, every creak of the wood beneath his feet setting off alarms in his head. When he reached the office door, he hesitated for a moment. It was as if the very darkness around him was alerting him to the danger of continuing, but he couldn't retreat now. Pushing the door open carefully, he entered the room. The darkness seemed almost suffocating, but he didn't dare turn on the main light. Instead, he used the flashlight on his cell phone, directing the beam of light onto the table where he had found the envelope earlier. He started rummaging through the drawers again, this time more carefully. Folder after folder, he found documents that at first glance seemed bureaucratic or irrelevant. But then, in a black folder with the faded seal of a local law firm, he found something that made his heart soar. Land acquisition contracts in the name of Luke Wallen. The papers were signed, or rather forged, with Luke's signature and linked his name to logging deals in protected areas. Luke flipped through the papers with increasing speed, his mind struggling to absorb what he was seeing. They were detailed contracts, transportation and export permits, all linked to an illegal logging operation. Julianne's name didn't appear anywhere. She had cleverly protected herself. But Luke, he was responsible for everything on paper. Panic began to take hold. He could clearly see what was happening. Julianne had masterminded the whole thing. She had put him in a position of trust just to use him as a scapegoat for her illegal operations. If it came to light, he would be the one to face the consequences. But why? Why would she choose him for such an elaborate plan? Was it just revenge for what his father had done to her family? Or was there something darker at play? Before he could deepen his thoughts, a noise from the corridor paralyzed him. The sound of footsteps, this time heavier, echoed in the wood. He quickly switched off the flashlight and held his breath. The hallway lights came on, and Julianne's shadow appeared under the door. "Luke, are you there?" Her voice cut through the silence like a knife. He felt cold sweat on his forehead. There was no time to hide the documents. He looked around frantically, but the only possible exit was the cupboard next to the desk. He hid there, squeezing between boxes of files, trying not to make the slightest noise. The office door opened slowly. Julianne entered, her steps deliberate. He could hear her breathing, slowly and rhythmically, as if she were pondering something. Luke peeked through a small gap in the cupboard. She was wearing a dark blue robe, and her hair was tied up in a messy bun. The contrast between her casual appearance and the tension in the air was almost surreal. Julianne walked over to the table. For a moment she just stood there, looking at the scattered papers, as if she knew someone had been there. She picked up one of the forged contracts and examined it carefully. After a few seconds, she let out a sigh but didn't seem surprised. "Luke, Luke," she muttered to herself, with a tone that mixed exasperation and something that sounded like regret. She put the paper back in the folder, closed it, and locked it in the drawer with a key she took from her robe pocket. Then she slowly turned and left, turning off the lights behind her. Luke remained hidden for several minutes after she left. When he finally emerged, fear had given way to determination. He knew he needed help, someone outside that house, someone who could look at the facts objectively and help him get out of that nightmare. The next morning, Luke left the mansion with the excuse that he needed to take care of some personal business in the city. Julianne didn't seem suspicious. On the contrary, she even encouraged him to go, with a smile that now seemed full of hidden intentions. He went straight to the office of Peter Rourke, his old friend and now a lawyer. Peter greeted him with a surprised but friendly look. "Luke, man, it's been ages. What brings you here?" asked Peter as he guided him to a chair in his small office. Luke wasted no time. He began to explain everything right from the start: the marriage to Julianne, the financial arrangement, the discoveries about his father, and finally the forged contracts. Peter listened in silence, but his expression became increasingly serious. "This is serious, Luke. Very serious. If these documents are in your name, you could be implicated in federal crimes. And from what you're telling me, Julianne planned this meticulously. I know that, and that's why I need your help." Luke's voice was hoarse, a mixture of frustration and desperation. "I don't know who else to trust." Peter took a deep breath, crossing his arms as he thought. "We can start by hiring a private investigator. If Julianne is involved in this kind of thing, there's a trail, there always is. The problem is, if she found out all about you before she brought you into this, she could be monitoring your every move now. We need to be careful." Luke nodded, knowing he had no other option. Luke returned to the Buckingham Mansion feeling that he had crossed a point of no return. Peter's words echoed in his mind. If she planned this meticulously, she must also be monitoring you. Every interaction with Julianne now felt like a game of chess, in which every word and gesture could conceal hidden intentions. He needed to act calmly, without arousing suspicion, but the tension was eating him up inside. The first night after his conversation with Peter was a test of nerves. During dinner, Julianne seemed particularly calm. Sitting at the head of the long, dark wood table, she sipped her red wine with an enigmatic smile, while asking trivial questions about Luke's day. "So, darling, did you sort out what you needed in town?" she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes assessing his every reaction. Luke almost choked on his food, but quickly pulled himself together. "Yes, just a few things from the bank, nothing much." She nodded slowly, seeming satisfied with the answer, but Luke couldn't help feeling that there was something more behind that smile. As she talked about a new batch of horses she wanted to buy for the farm, he pretended to pay attention, but his mind was elsewhere. He needed to access the locked drawer in the office again. Whatever Julianne was planning, the answers were there. That night, when Julianne retired, Luke waited patiently. He knew that she had a habit of going to bed early and that she had a relaxing cup of tea every evening. But even so, he waited for over an hour before quietly leaving her room. The house was shrouded in almost absolute silence, interrupted only by the ticking of a distant clock. He walked carefully down the stairs, avoiding the creaking steps. When he reached the office, he tried the door, but was not surprised to find that it was locked. Julianne seemed to be one step ahead in everything. He took a small paper clip from his pocket and started working on the lock. It was a skill he'd learned years ago, when he'd had to get into a locked cupboard at school to retrieve a lost assignment. After a few minutes of trying, the lock gave way with a soft click. Entering the office, he headed straight for the drawer where Julianne had locked her briefcase the night before. It was locked, as expected, but he wasn't going to give up so easily. Using the same paperclip, he managed to open the drawer after a few minutes of effort. Inside, he found not only the black folder, but also other documents that immediately caught his eye. An expenses spreadsheet showed payments to various accounts abroad. and there was a small diary in Julian's elegant handwriting. He opened to the most recent page and read, "He's starting to get suspicious. I need to act before he finds out." But part of me hesitates. It reminds me that I'm still capable of trusting someone, and that could be my biggest mistake. The words sent a shiver down Luke's spine. She knew he was investigating, but why was he hesitating? Was it out of genuine feeling, or was it part of a more elaborate game? Before he could think any further, he heard the sound of footsteps in the corridor. He quickly switched off the flashlight on his cell phone and hid behind the desk. The door creaked open, and he saw Julianne enter, wearing a dark robe and an expression that mixed curiosity and suspicion. She turned on the light and looked around. "Luke!" she called out, her voice firm but with a hint of doubt. He remained motionless, barely breathing. She glanced at the desk, noticing that the drawer was slightly open. His expression hardened. "So this is how it's going to be?" she murmured, as if talking to herself. "All right, Luke. Let's see how far you're willing to go." She closed the drawer tightly, locking it again, and left the office, turning off the light. Luke waited until her footsteps had distanced themselves before coming out of hiding. He knew he was in dangerous territory, but he needed more information before he could act. The next day, Luke met Peter again. He brought the documents he had obtained and told him about the diary. "She knows you're suspicious of her," said Peter, worried. "This could speed things up. If she has a plan to frame you, she'll try to put it into practice soon." "So what do I do?" Luke asked, desperate. "We need concrete evidence that links her directly to the crimes. These spreadsheets are good, but they still don't prove that she's responsible. I'll put the investigator to work full-time, but—" "Luke," Peter hesitated, "you need to protect yourself. Get out of there." Luke shook his head. "I can't. If I leave, she could destroy any remaining evidence. What's more, if she realizes I'm on the run, she can pin the whole thing on me before we can do anything." Peter sighed but agreed. "Right. But be careful. Don't trust her. Not for a second." Luke returned to the farm with the weight of the world on his back. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, and that any mistake could cost him not only his freedom, but also his life. Over the next few days, Julianne seemed more attentive to Luke's every move. She asked casual but incisive questions about where he was and what he was doing during the day. The atmosphere in the house became stifling, and Luke felt that at any moment the final confrontation could happen. One rainy afternoon, while he was working on the fence of one of the pastures, Julianne appeared with an umbrella. She watched him for a few minutes before speaking. "You look tense, darling. Is something bothering you?" He straightened up, trying to hide his apprehension. "No, I'm fine, just a bit tired." She tilted her head, as if studying every detail of his expression. "I hope you know you can trust me, Luke. Whatever is weighing on your mind, you can tell me." Luke forced a smile. "I know, Julianne. Thank you, Julianne." But she didn't seem convinced. When he got back to the house, Luke was sure that she was planning something, and he had to be ready. The storm raging over the farm seemed to reflect the chaos that dominated Luke's thoughts. Lightning briefly illuminated the fields, casting spectral shadows in the halls of the mansion. He was alone in his study, his papers spread out on the desk in front of him. Julianne had left that morning for an appointment in the city and had not yet returned. This was his chance to connect the pieces. The papers retrieved from the locked drawer painted a bleak picture. The spreadsheets, forged contracts and payments to offshore accounts indicated that Julianne was running a complex network of illegal logging. The use of Luke's name as legal guardian was the most disturbing piece of the puzzle. He had no doubt. Julianne had meticulously prepared a scenario to incriminate him, but there was something about the details that didn't add up. Why was Julianne hesitating? Her diary suggested regret, even an emotional attachment to him. Luke recalled the words he had read. It reminds me that I can still trust someone. Was this a game, an attempt to confuse him, or was she truly torn between her thirst for revenge and feelings she herself didn't understand? When the front door opened, Luke knew he was running out of time. He put the documents away in the drawer and switched off the office light, returning to the living room as if nothing had happened. Julianne entered with firm steps, shaking her umbrella to get rid of the water. Her eyes met Luke's immediately. "Still awake?" she asked, with a slight smile. "I thought you'd be asleep by now." "I couldn't sleep. The sound of the rain is too loud," he replied, trying to keep his voice calm. Julianne approached slowly, her presence dominating the space. She stopped a few steps away, tilting her head to study him. "You know, Luke, I was thinking today. I don't think you've ever told me why you actually accepted my marriage proposal. Was it just for the money?" The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, trying to find the right words. "I did it for my family," he admitted. "It wasn't an easy decision, not for you. You're still a very beautiful woman, and I'm sure you have many qualities. But all this, it's not easy." Julianne watched him for a long moment, as if looking for something in his eyes. Then she smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. "You're very honest, Luke. More than I expected. Maybe even more than I deserve." He felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in the way she said it that seemed to indicate that she knew more than she was letting on. The next morning, Peter called. The tone of his voice was urgent. "Luke, we did it. The investigator found a pattern of transactions that links Julianne directly to the deforestation operations. But there's more. It seems that she has a contact in a larger criminal network. This could extend much further than we thought." Luke took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the revelations. "What do I do now?" he asked. "We'll take this to the authorities. But you need to get out of there before she realizes what's going on. It's clear that she's already suspicious of you." Luke knew that Peter was right, but at the same time he felt he needed to face Julianne before making any final decisions. He wanted answers, and the only person who could provide them was her. That evening, while they were having dinner together, Luke finally summoned up the courage to speak. "Julianne, I need to know the truth," he said firmly. She looked up, surprised by the sudden change of tone. "The truth? About what?" she asked, carefully placing her fork on the table. "About what's really going on here. About the reason for this wedding. About what you have planned for me." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Julianne watched him for a long moment, her eyes analyzing every expression on his face. Then, finally, she spoke. "I knew you'd figure it out. You're smarter than I thought." Her voice was calm, but there was a note of weariness. "Yes, Luke, I brought you into my life for revenge. I wanted you to pay for your father's mistakes. I wanted your family to feel at least some of the pain that mine suffered." Luke felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He already knew the truth, but hearing it straight from her mouth was devastating. "So why did you hesitate?" he asked, his voice full of emotion. "I saw the forged documents with my signature in your drawer. You could have harmed me, but you seem to have given up. Why didn't you go ahead with your plan to blame me for the business irregularities?" Julianne looked away, her hands shaking slightly. "Because you're different. You're not like your father. I saw that from the start, but I didn't want to admit it. And as I got to know you, I began to see a way out for myself. Maybe I was wrong about you. And maybe I was wrong about me, about everything. I thought revenge would bring the peace I so desperately seek. But now I see that it wouldn't. It would only bring more pain and suffering, and involve even more people. And you're not to blame for the mess your father made. I'm sorry, Luke. I feel so ashamed. If I could go back, I wouldn't have started all this. I'm glad I realized it in time." Her words took him by surprise. He saw tears begin to form in her eyes. but Julianne quickly turned her face away, trying to hide her vulnerability. "Still, I've done unforgivable things." She looked at him again, her expression laden with guilt. "And now, everything is about to fall apart." Before Luke could reply, red and blue lights started flashing outside. The police had arrived. He stood up, his heart racing. "You called the police?" Julianne asked, incredulous. Luke shook his head. "It wasn't me." But he knew who had done it. Peter. Julianne took a deep breath and raised her hands. "I guess that settles it, doesn't it?" she said with a bitter smile. Luke shook his head, his emotions spilling over into his voice. "I didn't want it to be like this, Julianne." He hesitated, his eyes fixed on hers. "Even so, you're not the person I imagined at first. I see something more in you." Julianne took a step back, her expression changing. For a moment it looked like she was going to collapse, but she quickly regained her poise. "And what exactly do you see, Luke?" she asked defiantly. "A broken woman who's tried to right the wrongs of the past, a villain who failed, or just someone who couldn't move on?" Luke remained silent. There was a mixture of truth in all the options she had listed, but none of them completely captured what he felt. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "I see a woman who has suffered, who lost everything and didn't know how to cope." He paused, fighting the growing urgency of the moment. "But I also see someone who still has a chance to do the right thing." Julianne let out a short, bitter laugh. "Do the right thing," she repeated with a hint of sarcasm. "It's too late for that, Luke. It's always been too late for me." The sound of police footsteps outside interrupted the conversation. Luke felt time slip away like sand between his fingers. He knew he only had a few seconds to say something that could change the course of events, something that could reach the humanity that still remained in her. "It doesn't have to be the end, Julianne." His voice was low but charged with urgency. "They're going to come in and you can fight, resist. Or you can show that you're more than your actions. You can admit what you've done, but you can also start to repair the damage." Julianne stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. It was the first time he had seen her so vulnerable, so stripped of her masks and defenses. "And you?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "What are you going to do after this? Hate me for the rest of your life? Blame me for everything that's happened?" Luke shook his head slowly. "No, I can't hate you, Julianne." He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his next words. "My father destroyed your family, and you almost destroyed mine, but hatred only perpetuates this cycle. I want to break it. I want it to end here." The two were silent, the sound of the knocking on the door echoing through the mansion. "Julianne Buckingham! State Police! Open the door immediately!" Julianne closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. When she opened them again, there was an unexpected calm in her expression. "All right, Luke. I think it's time to finish this." She raised her hands in a gesture of surrender. "But know that if it hadn't been for you, I probably would have gone through with my plan. You reminded me that there is another way." Before he could reply, Julianne walked to the door and opened it. The policeman quickly entered, guns in hand, but she offered no resistance. As she was handcuffed, Julianne took one last look at Luke. "Take care of yourself, Luke. I hope you can forgive me one day." He watched her being led away, the mixture of emotions leaving him paralyzed. She had confessed her crimes when she was arrested, taking full responsibility. He knew the battle was far from over, but he felt that somehow they had reached an understanding. The weeks following the climax at the mansion were intense. Luke was called to give evidence several times, not only against Julianne, but also about the deforestation schemes and her connections to larger criminal networks. The media quickly picked up the story, turning Julianne Buckingham into a widely discussed name, while Luke unwittingly became part of the scandal. Julianne's trial was a spectacle. Defense and prosecution lawyers fought fiercely, and every detail of her private life was publicly scrutinized. Luke attended every hearing, not only to ensure that the truth was revealed, but also to testify about Julianne's more human side, the side he believed he had come to know in recent days. When the time came for his testimony, Luke found himself in front of a packed courtroom. He took a deep breath and began. "When I first met Julianne, I thought she was just a rich woman who wanted company and help with her farm. But over time I discovered that there was more to her than met the eye. She has made serious mistakes, yes, but she's also someone who has suffered unimaginable losses and tried, in the wrong ways, to find justice for herself." He paused, looking at Julianne, who was sitting with her hands clasped together, her eyes fixed on him. "I'm not here to excuse her, but I do believe that she is capable of recognizing her mistakes and changing. She's cooperated with justice, she's taken over all her illegal businesses, she's shown her repentance for everything. And that, I think, deserves consideration." Her statement helped reduce Julianne's sentence. Instead of decades in prison, she received a shorter sentence, with the possibility of parole in a few years. Luke knew it wasn't the perfect ending, but it was as close to justice as they could get. After the trial, Luke sold the Buckingham farm, using the funds to pay off his family's debts and establish the scholarship fund in Howard Buckingham's name. The gesture was more than reparation. It was a declaration that he wanted something positive to emerge from all that tragedy. He also began to rebuild his own life. He took a job with an investment company and gradually began to find stability. But even with his new routine, he never forgot Julianne. When she was released years later, Luke was waiting outside the prison. She looked different, thinner, more fragile, but also calmer. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, with a hesitant smile. "I told you I wanted to break the cycle. I think that includes starting again, really," he replied. The two of them walked together to Luke's car, leaving the past behind. As they drove, Julianne looked out of the window, the sunlight illuminating her face. "Thank you, Luke, for everything. I don't think I'd be alive if it wasn't for you." He just smiled, without replying. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were both ready to face it, together.